Hey everyone, GraphDBA here with another video, and today I'm talking about how to mount an Oracle database that was cloned with the Dell Powerstore thin clone and mounted to another server. But first, some boring legal stuff.
All copyrights belong to their respective owners. Images and text owned by other copyright holders are used here under the guidelines of the fair use provisions of US copyright law. Said images and text are used here only for educational purposes, not for making money. I work for Dell Technologies. Opinions expressed here are my own and do not necessarily represent Dell Technologies or any of its subsidiaries.
Okay, hopefully that made sense. Void where prohibited, your mileage may vary, etc., etc. Alright, let's recap where things are at. We have a database, a swing bench database, running on Oracle 1, and that swing bench database uses two ASM disk groups, swing data and FRA. On our Powerstore, we created a volume group around both of those ASM disk groups, and then we created a thin clone of the ASM disk groups, and we mounted that thin clone to the Oracle 2 server. We also renamed the ASM disk groups to clone swing data and clone FRA because there was already a swing data database on Oracle 2 that used ASM disk groups with the same names. I've logged into my Oracle 2 server. This is the VM to which I have mounted the thin clone of the ASM disk groups from Oracle 1. Throughout this video, I will denote Oracle 2 with a white on black background and Oracle 1 with a Commodore 64 inspired white on blue. With ASM CMD, I can show you that we have ASM disk groups, clone swing data and clone FRA mounted and available, as well as the existing swing data and FRA disk groups. There's also a data disk group which is used by another database on this same server. If I drop back to Oracle, I can show you that the swing instance, which is our swing bench database, is up and running, as is a slob instance, which will not be used as part of this demonstration. Over on Oracle 1, our source swing bench database is up and running, and I'm going to go ahead and log into that because there's one or two things we're going to need from our source database to get its clone up and running on Oracle 2. Back on Oracle 2, the first thing we need to do is to create a new instance to mount and open our database. Now, we could use DBCA to do this job, but that would create new database files for us, and we don't need new database files, we've already got them. We cloned them from Swingbench on Oracle 1. So I'm going to create two environmental variables, new DBN for my clone database name, and new SID for my clone database SID. You can see in this example I've set them both to be clonedb, but I'm going to keep using two variables because you might want to name them differently. Next, we're going to prepare an init file. We can't start an Oracle instance without an init file or an SP file. Now, Oracle gives us a basic init file in the Oracle home/dbs directory, but it's pretty basic and it's pretty out of date. The compatibility, for example, defaults to 11.2. So we're going to take that basic init file and we're going to remove and/or replace those settings that we need to change for our new instance. Next, we're going to add in some more settings that we need to start our database. Some of these will need to match the database that we've cloned from, such as compatible being set to 19.0 or enable pluggable database being set to false. Other settings will be dictated by the host on which we are launching the clone, such as DB unique name. Now that we have our init file, we can use server control to create our new instance. So let's make sure that we have the environment set correctly, and then we're going to use server control add database and specify our new database name, Oracle home instance, and the parameter file that we just created. We can now check our new database with server control config database and make sure that everything looks correct. But before we can start our new instance, there's one last thing that we need to do. We need to create the audit directory in Oracle Base. I'm also going to create directories for pfile and for datapump. We're not going to use those in this example, so feel free to leave them out, but they're there for completeness. Lastly, I'm going to add an entry to oratab. That just makes it easier for me to source my environment using the aura-env file. Okay, so we're ready to start our clonedb instance. Let's use aura-env to make sure that we have the environment set up correctly. And then we can use server control start database with the no mount option to start our instance to a no mount state. Of course, you could instead log in with SQL Plus and use startup no mount. It will do the exact same thing, so use whichever approach works for you. The instance is now running in a no mount state, and we can connect to it with SQL Plus/assysdba. If we do show SP file, we'll find out that there is no SP file. The instance has started using the init file that we just prepared. And if we do show control file, we'll find out that the database thinks that the control files are in Oracle Home/DBS. We know that's not correct. The control files are actually on the cloned ASM disk groups that we brought over from Oracle 1. But the first thing to do is to create an SP file, which will make our lives a lot easier. So we'll use create SP file from P file, and then we'll recycle the instance. I'm going to use server control to stop and restart my database back to a no-mount state. Of course, you could also use shutdown immediate followed by startup no mount, whichever works best for you. Having restarted the database, we're going to check to make sure that our SP file is now being used. There are two more things that we need to do before we can mount our database. As you know, we need to update our control files to point at the clone control files on the ASM disk groups. But we also need to update the DB name to match what the control files expect to see. If you're feeling particularly masochistic, or you get paid by the hour, you can certainly type out these commands character by character. But I'm going to save myself some work here by logging back into my source database on Oracle 1 and using a couple of scripts which generate the commands that I need to update the control files and the DB name. You'll note that our script that generates the command to set the control files uses a SQL regular expression that replaces the original ASM disk group names with the new ones. Once we've generated both commands, we'll apply them to our clonedb instance that started over on Oracle 2. And once we've done that, we should be able to shut down clonedb and then restart it to a mount state. With clonedb restarted, we can log in and then do show parameter control to see where the control files are sitting. As expected, we're reading our control files of clone swing data and clone FRA. The next job we have to do is to rename our data files. The control files that we have read still think that the data files are sitting in the swing data ASM disk group. On this server, of course, they're sitting in clone swing data. So again, we're going to use irregular expressions to replace the swing data disk group with the clone swing data and generate our rename command. We can then copy and paste that output to actually rename the data files. And then we have to repeat the same operation for our online redo logs. Now in this example, I'm generating these rename scripts on the clonedb. I can do that because once the database is mounted, $data file and $log file become visible. I could of course simply have generated the same output file from my source database on Oracle 1. And that's pretty much it. We've set our control files, we've renamed our data files, we've renamed our online redo logs. Now we can issue Alter Database Open and our clonedb is up, open and running on Oracle 2. Okay, so for those of you just joining us, here's a recap of the story so far. And I'm covering both this video and the previous one where we created the thin clone. We created a volume group for all the ASM disks and disk groups for the swing database on Oracle 1. We then created a thin clone of that volume group and we mapped it to Oracle 2. We added the disks to the Oracle 2 VM, and then we created udev rules to manage the device permissions. We then renamed the ASM disk groups to clone swing data and clone FRA, and we renamed the ASM disks within each clone disk group. We then mounted the clone swing data and clone FRA disk groups. In this video, we created the clonedb instance, we created an init.aura file for our clonedb, we started the clonedb instance, we created an SP file, we set the db name and the control files parameter, we then mounted the clonedb and we renamed the data files and the log files, and then we opened the database. Now, as entertaining as all that was, some people still prefer a fully automated point-and-click approach, so I will let you know that Dell Technologies has a solution we call Appsync. A full description of what it can do is too much for this video, but be aware that it supports Oracle and SQL Server and runs on most Dell Technologies block storage solutions. Also be aware that the next time you want to make a thin clone of your database, assuming that it's the same source and the same target, even the manual process is much simpler, because many of the steps do not have to be repeated. Now, why would we want to create another thin clone? Well, the thin clone is a snapshot. It's a point in time, so that transactions that continue to occur on the primary database will not be reflected in the clone. Powerstore, however, allows us to refresh our thin clone immediately updating the thin clone to the current state of the primary database. Be aware that our clone database and disk groups should be shut down before they are refreshed, otherwise they will crash. Here, let me show you. I am going to log into my Swingbench database on Oracle 1 as the SOE user, and I'm going to create a new database table called My New Table. I can select data from this table, and you'll see, of course, that it has one record. Now, if I go over to the CloneDB database on Oracle 2 and log in again as the SOE user, now if I try and select data from my new table, we'll get an error. The table does not exist. Of course it doesn't. The CloneDB database was created using a thin clone that was made before we created the new table. Any changes that occur on the source database after the thin clone is made are not present on the clone. We can refresh our thin clone by going into Powerstore, selecting Volume Groups, highlighting the Swing Clone Thin Clone, and then going to Repurpose and selecting Refresh using related volume groups. But if we do that while CloneDB is up and running, while Clone Swing Data and Clone FRA are online, we will crash the database and probably corrupt the disk groups. So first, we will shut down the CloneDB database, and then we will take Clone Swing Data and Clone FRA offline. Now, shutting down CloneDB in this manner is probably redundant. We're going to be refreshing the clone anyway, so who cares if CloneDB gets corrupted? But the shutdown will help ensure that any client sessions get a clean disconnect. We also do want to be able to take Clone Swing Data and Clone FRA offline, so that ASM won't give us any problems bringing them back online after we've refreshed the thin clone. With CloneDB shut down and our two ASM disk groups offline, we can now go back to the Powerstore interface to refresh our thin clone. So we're going to highlight our thin clone and then select Repurpose and Refresh using related volume group. The interface will then prompt us to select the volume group to refresh from. We're going to drop that down and select the volume group of the source database, which for us is O1 Swing VG. The interface will also offer us the option to make a snapshot copy of the existing state of CloneDB in case we want to go back to it later on. I don't, so I'm going to unselect that and then click Refresh. Powerstore should report the thin clone has been refreshed, and then we can go back to our target Oracle server. Now, unlike when we first created our thin clone, this time around there's no need to rescan the HBA adapters. There's no need to add the disks to the VM. There's no need, in fact, to even create the UDEV rules, as the WWN IDs of the volumes has not changed. If we look in Dev Oracle ASM, we'll see the same 5 disks that we saw before. But we can't bring our disk groups back online just yet, because the ASM disk group names have reverted back to the state they are on the source machine. That is Swing Data and FRA, which causes us a conflict, so we're going to have to rename them again. So we'll log in as the grid user, source our environment to ASM, and use the rename DG command again to change the name from Swing Data to Clone Swing Data, and from FRA to Clone FRA. Now once again, I'm using the check equals true flag on the first pass to make sure that my disk groups are not currently mounted elsewhere. It's completely redundant on a refresh, but I'm just doing it for completeness. With the ASM disk groups renamed, I'm going to log into ASM and use the alter disk group rename disk all command to change the names of the individual disks. Again, this really isn't necessary, but it just helps to keep everything complete. So to rename the disks, we'll mount Clone Swing Data and Clone FRA in restricted mode. We'll then issue the command to rename the disks. Then we'll unmount the ASM disk groups and finally remount them in unrestricted mode. We're pretty much done with the grid user now, so let's log in as Oracle and restart the CloneDB instance. When we restart CloneDB, we are going to start it to a mount state. Note that we do not have to recreate the CloneDB instance. It is local to Oracle 2 and thus unaffected by us refreshing the Clone Swing Data and Clone FRA disk groups. And provided that we did not place the SP file on any disk groups being refreshed, we do not need to recreate the SP file either. We put it in Oracle Home/DBS, so it will still be there. And recall that our SP file knows the control files are in clone swing data and clone FRA, which we've just put back, so we can mount the database. But those control files have been refreshed, so once again the control files think that the data files and the log files are in swing data and FRA. We are going to need to rename them again. So we'll set the page size to 999 and the line size to 255, and then we'll use that same script to generate the rename commands using regular expressions to replace swing data with clone swing data. We can then copy that output and paste it back into SQL Plus to execute the rename command. Then we'll repeat the same operation for the log files. Note that both of these scripts, in fact all of the scripts that you've seen me use in these videos, will be available on my blog, and I'll include a link in the description below. And that's everything done. We've renamed our ASM disk groups, we've renamed our ASM disks, we've renamed our data files, and we've renamed our log files. We should now be able to open the database. And having done that, we can connect as the SOE user and see if our new table is now there. And that's all we have time for today. As you can see, our new database table is present on the clone and the data can be read. So this concludes the video. To recap what we did, we shut down the CloneDB database on Oracle 2. We dismounted the clone swing data and clone FRA disk groups. We then refreshed the thin clone using the Powerstore. Next, we renamed the ASM disk groups to clone swing data and clone FRA, as they had reverted to their original names. And we renamed the ASM disks for completeness. We were then able to restart the CloneDB to a mount state and rename the data files and redo log files to match the renamed ASM disk groups, at which point we could reopen the database and observe that the changes on the source database on Oracle 1 were now present on the clone database on Oracle 2. I hope that was useful. If you liked the video, maybe click like or even subscribe. Apparently that's a good thing. I don't really know. I'm still new to this whole video making thing. And as previously stated, all of the scripts shown, as well as a complete description of what we did, are shown on my blog at graphdba.wordpress.com. Thanks, and I hope to see you all again soon, before too long.